Hey everyone, and welcome back to Newegg TV. My name is Paul. Today's video is once again about AMD's new R9 290X graphics card. Now we've already had a couple videos on this card. We showed you a single card configuration with benchmarks. We showed you a two-way Crossfire configuration with benchmarks. But I know our fans are all about what is the best of the best, what's the max that you can possibly do, and that would be four-way 290X Crossfire configuration. So I have that right here, and to save you guys from having to click the jump to benchmarks button, I'm just going to put the benchmarks first. Let's jump right into it and take a look at the hardware. This is the Newegg TV test bed. It's currently housed in an in-win D-frame case. That's the orange and blue version. Our motherboard there at the back is an Asus ROG Rampage 4 Formula motherboard. Processor right there at the center is an Intel Core i7-3970X CPU. That's a Sandy Bridge E on the X79 platform, socket 2011, and it's overclocked to 4.5 gigahertz. Our memory is 4 sticks of Trident X DDR3. This memory is actually rated up to, I think, like 2400, but we're currently running it at 1866. Our cooler right here is a Cooler Master Sidon XL 120 millimeter closed loop cooler. And then, of course, we have our video cards over on the left side for AMD Radeon R9 290X graphics cards. And in case you're wondering, we have two that are sample cards directly from AMD, and two of those are retail box cards right out of the box, brand new. So, and then finally for power for the entire thing, we've got a Hercules 1600 watt power supply. Next up, benchmarks. Here you go. So now you guys know what kind of performance you might expect if you're going to go with a three-way or a four-way Crossfire configuration with AMD R9 290X graphics cards. But there's a lot more to be said about this, and what I'm going to do is wait till more towards the end of this video to get into kind of the pros and cons of this situation, talk a little bit more about power draw, heat, and all that sort of thing. What I want to talk about right now is just the raw benchmark numbers that we've seen, because there's a lot of elements, a lot of different factors that go into benchmark numbers and the type of frame rate that you might expect depending on the game you're using, depending on the driver support, especially for these three-way and four-way configurations, which you're really not going to see as much as a simple single or two-way Crossfire configuration. So for starters, you'll notice that with a single card and with two-way configuration, you're pretty much always going to see a boost. It wasn't necessarily always like close to that 100% jump that you want to see when you go from a single to a two-way configuration, but it was always something. It was either maybe 50% more or 80% more or thereabouts. The three-way and four-way configurations were a little bit more hit and miss. So first off, let's talk about the synthetic benchmarks running 3D Mark, Firestrike, Firestrike Extreme, as well as 3D Mark 11. With those, you'll notice that with 3D Mark in particular, the scaling just fell right off after the two-way configuration for the overall scores. But if you look at the graphics scores in particular, those kept scaling all the way up, and we saw some pretty amazing graphics scores for both 3D Mark 11 as well as 3D Mark Firestrike and Firestrike Extreme. When it comes to the real games, I pretty much grouped these into good scaling and bad scaling. The bad scalers was Metro Last Light, Bioshock, and Battlefield 4 at 1080. I can't really explain the Battlefield 4 at 1080 thing because Battlefield 4 has scaled pretty well in most of my other testing configurations, but 1080 didn't do much. The good scalers was Battlefield 3, and bear in mind when you're looking at the Battlefield 3 numbers, there's a 200 frames per second cap on that engine. You really can't go beyond that, so that's why once it's 200, you really have nowhere to go. Crysis 3 did very well as Battlefield 4, so that should be some excellent news for any folks who are looking to get a new system going for some Battlefield 4 gameplay. But I feel like there's a little bit more to this story, because when you talk about high-end graphics configurations, when you look at AMD's marketing material specifically for these graphics cards, they have not designed them to work for at 1080. They have designed them to work for 4K, because that's really what the future, or what we're expecting the future to bring. We're probably going to see a lot more adoption of that next year. But unfortunately, I do not actually have a 4K monitor here at Newegg TV to do my testing with quite yet. But I do have 3 NEC PA301W monitors, which are awesome, which are all 2560 by 1600. So if you look at 4K resolutions that are currently on the market, at least the standards that are being set up for that, there's quite a few of them. It's a bit of a mishmash right now. But if you take the vertical and the horizontal resolution and you multiply them by each other, that will tell you how many pixels you're actually getting with that 4K resolution. And basically you're getting between 8.3 and 8.8 million pixels with 4K. If you take 3 2560 by 1600 monitors, that makes 7680 by 1600, and that gives you a total of 12.2 million pixels. So I was actually benchmarking with about 4 million pixels more, give or take, than 4K resolution. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump in and see how these cards fare when they're dealing with that many pixels and a much higher resolution than simple 1080 or 1600. So looking at these numbers, and sorry if this one's a little bit cluttered, but I have included Heaven Valley, Crysis 3, Bioshock Infinite, as well as Battlefield 3 and 4. And once again, we can see different scaling depending on which test you're running. So Heaven 4.0 and Valley 1.0 didn't really give us much, going from even single, two-way, three-way, and four-way, given that it was dealing with this many pixels in triple monitor mode. Crysis 3, however, it did give us some decent scaling. I mean, we saw some improvement, although if you can consider adding an entire new graphics card might give you about 5 to 10 frames per second more, it's okay. I mean, I guess considering that Crysis 3 starts off at 11.78 frames per second at this resolution, you kind of do need a bit more than that. Bioshock Infinite, again, gave us some nice scaling from single to two-way. Three-way and four-way were kind of neck and neck. They gave it a little bit of a bump over two-way. And then Battlefield 3, which has always scaled very well, we can see jumping from 27 to 49 to 69 to 84.98. I also noticed that four-way configuration and about 85 frames per second in Battlefield 3, minimum frame rate there was 60. So if you're planning on playing Battlefield 3 at this resolution and you want to hit 60 frames per second, that's your 290X four-way. That's what you want to go for. Finally, Battlefield 4, newest game from this current batch, and again, pretty much unplayable with a single card here. We did average 30 frames per second with a two-way configuration, and we jumped up again a bit beyond that, going to three-way and four-way. Next up, we have the power draw slide, and here's where I'm going to move more towards some of the pros and cons, or I guess mostly cons at this point, of going with this type of configuration, because it is somewhat impractical. You can see going from a 280X to a 290X, a little bit more power. Jumping up to a two-way configuration, quite a bit more power, and then you're going to see between a 200 and 250 watt jump every time going from two-way to three-way to four-way. So yes, you're going to need a really beefy power supply for a four-way configuration. I was pulling 1225. It even shot up a bit beyond that. I'm sure if I did a power virus or something, I could go up even higher than that. But you need a big power supply. You need to not be worried about power bills. And the nice thing here, though, is at idle, and I think this is due to AMD's power tune technology. They're really not adding that much wattage at idle. So when the computer's not playing a 3D game, at least you're still not pulling that much power. So as you can see, running triple monitors, particularly running triple monitors at 7680 by 1600, does require quite a bit of graphical horsepower in order to push the amount of frames that you want to run. Now, something I really want to point out here is that when I'm running that resolution, when you're running 4K or something that high of resolution, it really negates the necessity of having stuff like anti-aliasing in particular. The pixels are so close together that anti-aliasing doesn't really do much. So when I'm running my tests, in order to keep everything comparable to each other, I use all the same settings. Practically speaking, if I was running that resolution, I would not have all of the anti-aliasing turned up, and I would not be playing everything at ultra settings. There's some give and take there, so you can lower some of those things. So that's something to keep in mind. You can achieve higher frame rates than what I just showed you running this configuration by simply adjusting some of your graphics settings. But let's jump into some of the cons of this type of configuration, because really outside of videos like this, situations like we have here at Newegg, where we have access to a lot of this really awesome high-end hardware, you're not going to see a whole lot of people trying to set up these configurations. You'll see them here and there. You'll see showcase builds that they'll bring to conventions and stuff like that. But first off, let's talk about heat. Now, the GPUs in these cards, the 290Xs, are designed by AMD to run at 94 degrees Celsius, and they will achieve that. Just about any test that you put on them, you let the card heat up, it will get up to 94, 95 degrees Celsius, and that's simply because the card is trying to maximize the amount of power it gives you within that envelope. I have trusted AMD that is how the GPUs are designed. They're meant to run at that temperature, so I'm not necessarily concerned about the fact that the GPUs are running at 94 degrees Celsius, but that's a hot piece of hardware to have in your system. Putting 2 of them, or 3 of them, or 4 of them next to each other and running them at full speed presents a bit of a space heater issue, I might say. Fantastic for winter. I was actually doing a bit of this testing in my garage, and I could definitely tell the temperature was rising after I was running multiple benchmarks. So you're going to want a case. Maybe you might not want a case. I was testing it just like this, so I had open air. I have a couple fans down here, but you're directing some air flow up and over those cards. But you're definitely, whatever situation you set these up in, you're going to want to have plenty of airflow to push any of that heat out of the case to make sure you evacuate it somehow. So if you're in a situation where you can have your computer situated off to the side, or maybe even like around the corner in a different room or something like that, maybe you can get around that sort of thing. The other thing to keep in mind is going to be noise. As these fans spin up, as the GPUs spin up, you will notice that they generate some noise. Now right now this is at idle. You might be able to hear just a little bit. Actually, all I can really hear right now is the pump on our cooler. But let me give you guys a kind of a subjective example I just recorded earlier when I was running a test on this. This is using the in-camera audio, so bear in mind it's a bit subjective, but here's how these cards sound when they're running at full speed. So as you can see, once all of these fans get spinning up with a heavy load on the GPUs, it's generating quite a bit of noise. So that's another thing to bear in mind. Now, again, some folks with the heat, with the noise, if you can put the computer somewhere where it's not going to be blasting heat right on you, if you're going to wear a headset while you're gaming, maybe all of those things are perfectly fine to work with. The last thing to keep in mind when you're going with this type of configuration, as I mentioned, it's very, very limited, the number of people who are actually going to be setting this up. Therefore, the driver and software support is not always where you would expect it to be, or at least where you might expect it to be if you're comparing it to what's set up for a single GPU or a dual GPU solution. When you're running this type of configuration, you're really dependent on AMD's driver support as well as software support for the games that you're playing so that they can talk to each other and really get the most out of your GPUs. We can see some games that do that, games like Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4, which are AAA title games which have a lot of development dollars behind them. They're going to make sure that you're set up in those situations. Plus, they know that there's going to be people like me who are actually going to say, what can this type of configuration do with that game? But that's not going to be the situation all the time. You saw some of the other benchmarks barely really even gave you a boost going at least beyond a two-way configuration. The practicality of this configuration is just not very practical, I guess, is the conclusion that I'm coming up with. But at least you can see that if you really do want the most possible performance, everything else be damned, this is an excellent solution for that. And it's definitely I don't want to say it's practical, but when it comes to a dollars standpoint, it's a lot more accessible than some of the other high-end configurations like this have been in the past. So that's something to keep in mind as well. This is much more accessible, and if you can't quite pull together the dough for a 4-way 290X configuration, a 4-way 290 configuration would probably be able to achieve very close to these numbers that I showed you guys here today. But that is going to wrap it up for this video, guys. I hope you have enjoyed it. I certainly have enjoyed my time here with our 290Xs. I'm going to be very sad to see them go. We are going to keep a couple of them around, so we'll be doing some future benchmarks and stuff like that, if not for comparisons. Any other demonstrations or stuff like that that you guys would like to see, I'd love to hear it. Go ahead and leave me a comment down in the comment section below. Don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and if you'd like to see me kind of go all out with crazy configurations like this one we see here before me. Coming soon, we're actually going to be updating our test beds here. We've got some Ivy Bridge E processors that we're going to be dropping in there, and so that's very exciting. Looking forward to that, so stay tuned for that video. I'll be giving you guys a demonstration. We'll see you all next time, guys. Thank you very much for watching.